Yo and welcome to my Black Mage guide for the new E9 Eden's Promise Umbra. I hope everyone is as excited as I am to get stuck into some new content. As before, I'm going to put together a series of real-time guides for this Eden tier. The idea behind them is to create a slightly more tailored experience for a Black Mage, such as what they can do to optimise their positioning, to avoid mechanics and minimise movement where possible. I'll also include some diagrams which I hope give a more visual representation of what some of the mechanics are doing. If you have any questions or suggestions, please let me know, otherwise I hope you enjoy. Start off by staying centre and moving forward, place your ley lines down with the rest of the group. First up is Ground Raising Particle Beam, which is a raid-wide AoE. This will then be followed by the Art of Darkness. This will cause one of the floating heads to begin to glow, and then it will cleave that half of the platform, so simply stand on the opposing side. As the attack is based on the direction she is facing, it's worth bearing in mind that later on, if she's facing the tank on an angle, the cleaves will also be on an angle. Wide Angle Particle Beam targets a random player other than the main tank and does what it says on the tin, so be ready to jump if you need to. There's now a really nice cushy gap of around about 30 seconds or so before you have to move for any mechanics that cast away. The boss will now cast Empty Plane. This will transform the arena into a 5x5 grid of tiles. Not long after, the very corner tiles will be removed and the centre tile will be replaced by a puddle of darkness which you cannot stand in. It's instant death if you do. Flood of Emptiness also applies a debuff called Cloying Condensation. The debuff itself is nothing to worry about. The main point of this phase is to not stand on any one of the tiles for too long. If any tile is occupied for too long, it will begin to turn pink, which is what we want to avoid, so simply just keep moving between tiles to avoid any damage. Simply stand on the junction of several panels and it makes it very easy to step between them. Another Art of Darkness, so keep an eye on where the main tank is standing, as this will most likely end up being on an angle. This is also a good place to put down your next ley lines, as it pre-positions you well for the first mechanic after the Obscure Woods transition. A little extra thing to be careful of here is that the Obscure Woods transition also does a reasonable amount of AoE damage, so it might be worth just using your mana ward if you're uncertain as to whether or not you have enough HP. Be ready to use Shorecast for the Flood of Obscurity knockback, and don't stand in any of the puddles. Shortly after they appear, the puddles will tether to the nearest player. The tether will then become a chain and you must run away from the puddle to break it. These chains are a lot like the ones back in Titania. You will find it far easier to break them if you wait until the chain appears before you start running. Keep an eye out for another Art of Darkness, as it will most likely be on an angle. Coming up next is Wide Angle Phaser. This is probably the most unforgiving mechanic in that it doesn't give you an awful lot of time to react. The boss will tether herself to one side of the arena, then fly to that side and cast a very wide angle cleave. The safe zones will be either side of her up against the edge. After this, she'll return to the centre of the arena and cast Rejuvenating Bomb. This will create two very large circle AoEs on either the north and south or the west and east sides of the platform. Simply run to one of the non-tethered sides and stand up against the puddle. Deluge of Darkness will then transition back into the original platform. As before, this does a fair amount of AoE damage itself, so just be careful in case you need to use your mana ward. I then found it easiest to put my next ley lines down on the south side, or to be honest, whichever side is opposite to the main tank. Particle Concentration will then create 4 Orb Towers, which needs to be soaked by at least one player. Ideally, as a Black Mage, we don't want to get involved in that, so we'll just stay here. As the orbs are about to hit, there'll be another cheeky Art of Darkness, so just keep an eye on which side to stand on. There's now almost 30 seconds of free casting time, so get comfy. The platform transitions will now begin to repeat, but with the addition of a couple of extra mechanics to watch out for. Empty Plane will take us back to the 5x5 grid of tiles. As before, the very corner tiles will be removed and the centre tile will become darkness. The difference this time round is that 2 clouds will appear on 2 opposing cardinals. These clouds will then move towards the boss. Now, exactly the same as when we saw them in the World of Darkness Alliance raid, you can stand in between the boss and the clouds to slow them right down. This makes it considerably easier to DPS them down before they reach the boss, otherwise she will gain a damage up buff. The tile movement mechanic is actually really generous in terms of the amount of time it gives you before you have to move, so you've got plenty of time for casting throughout. The boss will then summon down 2 spectres which will cast column AoEs down 2 sides of the platforms. At the same time there will be a large point blank AoE around the boss, so you need to make sure you move out accordingly. Now, I found the placement of this ley lines to be a bit more tricky and perhaps open to debate. Firstly, I chose this position because it was easy to avoid either orientation of the summons, the line AoEs. The junction is also good because it allows you to easily avoid the tiles. The final reason is that Art of Darkness that comes up during that phase, obviously based on the tank's position. After doing several runs of this, I found the main tank will tend to go northwest whilst they're trying to avoid the tiles and jumping between them. So I found that quite often the Art of Darkness cleave, it would be based on a diagonal northwest to southeast orientation, so it made it easier for me to avoid either side. Obviously that's not guaranteed because it will depend on what your tank does in the moment, but that's just my suggestion. After the transition we got the puddles and the chains again, exactly the same as before, just wait until your chain appears before running. You'll find it much easier to break it and you don't have to run as far. This is followed up by another wide angle phaser, so be ready to run to the side of the arena that she tethers to, standing either side of the centre up against the edge. The boss will then return to the centre and it's time for another Rejuvenating Bomb. So once again we'll need to stand on one of the sides that isn't tethered and stand up against the puddle. The difference this time round is that there'll be an Art of Darkness as well, but the orientation of this is fixed. It will literally be right down the middle of this safe spot, so just be ready to stand on the opposing side of the glowing head. As you can see, it's a really easy no-brainer in terms of ley lines position there. You just wait for the tethers to appear before putting it down on the side that you need to stand on. Deluge of Darkness transitions back to the original platform, and that's it in terms of mechanics for this fight. From here on out, it simply repeats of what we've already seen until she's down. Next up will be my guide for E10 Eden's Promise Litany. But in the meantime, if you do have any questions or want to leave any comments, please do so. I'm always really interested to hear from other Black Mages and what they find is easiest and their way of making fights more and more efficient. So look forward to hearing from you, and yeah, hope you enjoyed the guide, and I'll see you next time.